Tonight, we catalog what we know about the most controversial Silent Hill game in decades, the one that has the fan base arguing whether it's a faithful return or a complete betrayal of everything the series represents. Whether you're a longtime fan worried about the series' direction or a newcomer curious about the fog-covered town, this is what we know about Silent Hill F as we approach its release. Opening: The Return to Japan. Silent Hill returns to its Japanese roots with Silent Hill F, and the implications of that choice ripple through every aspect of the game's design. After decades of Western developers attempting to capture the essence of what made the original Team Silent games special, Konami has handed the franchise to Taiwan-based Neobards Entertainment, a studio founded in 2017 with previous work on Resident Evil, Resistance, and Devil May Cry HD Collection. But don't mistake this for a Team Silent reunion. Masahiro Ito, the original monster designer who created Pyramid Head, explicitly confirmed on Twitter that he knows nothing about Silent Hill F because he didn't work on it. Team Silent disbanded after Silent Hill 4, The Room in 2004, and this new entry represents something entirely different. This cultural shift carries profound implications that become clearer when examining the series' history. Team Silent, operating from Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo between 1999 and 2004, revolutionized survival horror by prioritizing emotional resonance over commercial appeal. As the original director explained, their low-budget approach allowed them to focus on horror-oriented design rather than wider commercial appeal. The team created what University of Oregon researchers describe as modern American horror through Japanese eyes, drawing from J-horror traditions that emphasize psychological tension, building, and fear of the unknown over explicit violence. The Western interpretation period from 2007 to 2012 fundamentally misunderstood this cultural approach. Games like Silent Hill, Homecoming emphasized explicit violence, action-oriented combat, and conventional horror movie aesthetics, directly contradicting the series' vulnerability themes. Silent Hill F represents a conscious rejection of this Western interpretation, with producer Al Yang stating the team wanted to avoid overly westernized approaches that dominated the franchise's middle period. The game launches September 25th, 2025, across PlayStation 5, Xbox, Steam, Epic Games Store, and Microsoft Store. Pre-orders opened on June 5th following the official announcement during PlayStation's State of Play. The standard edition runs $69.99, while the digital deluxe costs $79.99 and grants 48-hour early access starting September 23rd. This is the first mainline Silent Hill game to receive an M rating specifically for blood and gore, intense violence, partial nudity, and themes including gender discrimination, child abuse, and graphic violence. Content warnings that suggest Neobards isn't pulling punches with their interpretation of psychological horror. What makes this entry unique isn't just its return to Japanese development, but its complete commitment to authentically Japanese storytelling. The script comes from Ryukishi 07, creator of the Higurashi When They Cry series, a writer known for psychological horror that dissects small-town secrets and societal pressures. His involvement signals that Silent Hill F won't simply use Japan as exotic window dressing, but will dig into specifically Japanese cultural anxieties in the way the original games explored American suburban decay. Setting and time period, 1960s, Japan. Silent Hill F transports players to Ebisugaoka, a fictional mountain town inspired by real Kaneyama during the Showa era of the 1960s. This isn't the America that never was aesthetic of previous games, but a deliberately chosen historical moment that carries specific cultural weight. The 1960s in Japan represented rapid social change, the end of traditional family structures, the emergence of modern consumer culture, and increasing tension between old and new ways of life. For a horror game exploring themes of societal pressure and family trauma, this setting provides rich psychological soil. This historical specificity stands in stark contrast to the generic small-town America settings that defined most previous Silent Hill games. While the original Silent Hill drew power from American suburban decay and industrial decline, Silent Hill F mines distinctly Japanese cultural anxieties. The period features the good wife, wise mother social expectation that confined women to domestic roles, while the country experienced double-digit economic growth, creating tension between traditional values and rapid modernization. The choice of Kanayama as inspiration reflects deep research into authentic Japanese environments. The development team visited the actual location for photogrammetry and researched 1960s Japan extensively, collecting reference materials from Tokyo libraries. Kanayama has what Ryukishi07 describes as an extremely unique townscape, showing how structures evolved with residents' lifestyles, representing the cultural transformation anxiety central to 1960s Japan. The town itself reflects this historical tension. Screenshots and preview footage show traditional Japanese architecture alongside early modern conveniences, the kind of place where ancient shrines sit next to general stores selling candy and toys. The visual design emphasizes the contrast between beauty and decay that runs through Japanese aesthetic philosophy. Cherry blossoms bloom on twisted trees, traditional festivals mask underlying violence, and the fog that transforms the town carries both natural beauty and supernatural menace. Environmental storytelling appears throughout the preview footage. Newspaper clippings reference geological instability, geysers spewing poisonous water, small earthquakes, foxes entering town carrying disease. These details aren't arbitrary flavor text, but carefully chosen elements that reinforce the town's fundamental wrongness. Something beneath Ebisugaoka stirs, and the natural world responds with warning signs that the residents either ignore or rationalize away. It's the same kind of environmental foreshadowing that made the original Silent Hill's industrial decay so effective, adapted for a very different cultural context. The 1960s setting also allows the game to explore gender roles and family expectations that would have been particularly restrictive for young women. Our protagonist exists in a world where her options are limited, her voice is constrained, and her rebellion carries serious social consequences. This historical specificity grounds the horror in recognizable human struggles rather than generic supernatural threats. Character and story. Hinako's world. Shimizu Hinako serves as our protagonist, a high school student voiced by Konatsu Kado in Japanese and Susie Young in English. Based on the character profiles revealed in preview coverage, Hinako represents a specific type of Japanese heroine, the girl who refuses to conform to expected social roles despite the cost. She's described as tall for her age, athletic from her track and field club participation, and stubborn enough to make decisions she later regrets rather than accept what others decide for her. This represents a fundamental shift from previous Silent Hill protagonists, particularly in terms of agency. Ryukishi07 specifically wanted to create Hinako as a character who actively makes her own choices rather than being pulled along by the story. This addresses his observation that female characters in previous Silent Hill games endured significant suffering without agency. Unlike Harry Mason stumbling through Silent Hill searching for his daughter, or James Sunderland drawn to the town by forces beyond his understanding, Hanako drives the narrative through her own decisions and rebellion against social constraints. The family dynamics driving the story feel authentically rooted in 1960s Japanese social structures. Hinako lives with an abusive father who explodes into violence when crossed, a mother too frightened to protect her children, and the shadow of an older sister who married and left home, the perfect daughter who followed the expected path. These aren't generic dysfunctional family tropes, but specific cultural pressures that would have shaped young women's lives during this historical period. Supporting characters include Iwai Shu, described as Hinako's childhood friend and partner in make-believe games, Nishida Rinko, a put-together friend focused on clothes and feminine pursuits who has a crush on Shu, and Igarashi Sakuko, the strange priest's daughter who owes Hinako money and takes pride in wearing traditional Miko robes. These relationships suggest a coming-of-age story interrupted by supernatural horror, the familiar social dynamics of teenagers navigating friendship, romance, and identity suddenly twisted by the town's transformation. The character development approach draws heavily from Ryukishi 07's experience with When They Cry series, where he mastered the technique of contrasting everyday warmth with creeping dread. However, for Silent Hill F, he simplified his usual approach of complex, multi-trait characters to focus each character around one singular, profound aspect. This streamlining serves the horror narrative while maintaining the psychological depth that made his previous work effective. Ryukishi 07's script emphasizes giving Hinako agency rather than making her a passive victim. In developer interviews, he stressed creating a female protagonist who drives the story forward through her own choices rather than being pulled along by events. This approach aligns with his previous work in Higurashi, where female characters often serve as the most psychologically complex and active participants in unfolding mysteries. Gameplay mechanics, the combat controversy. Silent Hill F has sparked intense debate within the fan base over its combat system, and understanding why requires examining what actually changed and how it relates to the series' evolution. Previous Silent Hill games featured clunky, deliberately awkward combat designed to make players feel vulnerable and unprepared. Guns were unreliable, melee weapons felt improvised, and the overall experience emphasized survival over action. Silent Hill F takes a different approach that represents both evolution and controversy. To understand the significance of these changes, we need to examine Team Silent's original design philosophy. Their combat deliberately discouraged engagement through clumsiness and resource scarcity. Silent Hill 1's unsteady aim reflected Harry's inexperience as an ordinary father thrust into nightmare circumstances. Silent Hill 2 refined this approach with improved weapon variety while maintaining fundamental vulnerability themes. As Keiichiro Toyama explained, their low-budget constraints actually enabled horror-focused design rather than action-oriented mechanics. The Western interpretation period from 2007 to 2012 fundamentally misunderstood this design principle. Silent Hill Homecoming introduced full-action game combat with combos, dodging and targeting systems justified by protagonist Alex Shepard's military background. Origins added unarmed combat and extensive weapon variety. These changes completely missed the mark for Silent Hill's psychological horror approach, according to both fan and critical consensus. Silent Hill F attempts to find middle ground through what producer Motoi Okamoto describes as action horror, rather than Souls-like gaming. The game features exclusively melee combat with no firearms. Weapons include iron pipes, sickles, ceremonial daggers, baseball bats, scythes, and traditional naginata. Each weapon has durability that degrades with use, forcing players to constantly search for replacements or use limited repair kits. The combat system incorporates stamina management, weapon durability, dodge mechanics, and a counterattack system activated when enemies display vulnerability indicators. What's controversial isn't the presence of these mechanics. Stamina meters appeared in Silent Hill 3 and 4, but their implementation and emphasis. Preview coverage reveals that combat encounters require careful timing, resource management, and strategic thinking in ways that feel more active and demanding than previous entries. Players must read enemy patterns, manage stamina consumption, and execute precise counters to survive difficult fights. This represents producer Al Yang's stated goal to make the action stand out more, to appeal to younger audiences while avoiding simply recreating Silent Hill 2 over and over again. The most innovative addition is the sanity mechanic, which functions as a finite resource similar to ammunition in classic survival horror. Taking damage, witnessing disturbing events, or using focus mode gradually depletes Hinako's mental state. Focus mode allows players to slow time and highlight enemy attack patterns, but at the cost of sanity points. Focus attacks deal massive damage but consume significant sanity and reduce the maximum capacity, creating strategic decisions about when to use these powerful abilities. This system attempts to reconcile psychological horror with challenging action gameplay. Unlike traditional health systems that represent physical damage, the sanity mechanic creates psychological consequences for effective combat. Players who rely too heavily on focus abilities find their maximum mental capacity permanently reduced, forcing difficult choices between immediate survival and long-term psychological stability. Sanity restoration occurs primarily at Hokora shrines, using faith currency earned by offering items or through rare consumable items found throughout the world. This creates meaningful choices between immediate needs and long-term planning. Do you drink that healing item now or save it to offer at a shrine for permanent upgrades? The interconnected nature of these systems, combat, sanity, faith, and spiritual currency, creates gameplay loops that feel distinctly different from traditional Silent Hill experiences. The faith system operates through these Hokora shrines, which serve as save points, upgrade stations, and narrative touchstones. Players earn faith currency by offering items, food, tools, ceremonial objects at these sacred locations. Higher value offerings provide more faith, but also represent items that could have been used for immediate healing or utility. Faith can then be spent on random Omamori charms that provide equipable buffs, though players initially can only equip one charm at a time. This shrine-based progression system draws from authentic Japanese spiritual practices while creating modern RPG mechanics. Unlike the symbolic save systems of original Silent Hill games, Harry's notebooks, James's red squares representing Mary's letter, Heather's halo of the sun symbols, Silent Hill F's shrines serve multiple mechanical functions while maintaining cultural authenticity. Monsters and Japanese folklore integration. The creature design in Silent Hill F represents one of the most culturally specific approaches in the series' history. Rather than drawing from generic horror imagery or Western psychological symbols, the monsters emerge directly from Japanese folklore, cultural anxieties, and linguistic wordplay that would be immediately recognizable to Japanese players, but require translation and explanation for international audiences. This approach fundamentally differs from both Team Silent's symbolic methodology and Western developers' literal interpretations. Masahiro Ito, Team Silent's creature designer, explained that he tended to remain astray from orthodox beasts resembling demons, instead creating creatures that represented psychological states rather than traditional horror monsters. His designs drew inspiration from Francis Bacon paintings and abstract psychological concepts. Western developers took a more literal approach, often recycling existing monsters without understanding their symbolic meaning. Producer Tom Hewlett recognized this problem, stating he made a big stink about including Pyramid Head in Homecoming, arguing it was designed for James's specific psychological state and teams should strive for originality over recycling. Silent Hill F's monster design comes from artist Kira, known for work on Spirit Hunter series and Lord of Vermilion. Kira aims for visual style distinct from blood-smeared, rusting scenery while maintaining Silent Hill familiarity. The design philosophy emphasizes fusion of delicate beauty and rot, merging grotesque horror with natural beauty. This represents evolution from Team Silent's purely psychological symbolism toward what Ryukishi 07 describes as finding the terror in beauty. When something becomes too immensely beautiful and perfect, it becomes deeply unsettling. Kashimashi exemplify this approach. These grotesque doll women feature mannequin joints, distorted feminine features, and movements that suggest broken automation. The name comes from kashimashi, a term meaning multiple women talking loudly or noisy feminine chatter. In the context of 1960s Japanese society, this reflects specific anxieties about women's voices, social roles, and the threat of female agency. The monsters literally embody the fear that women who speak too freely become monstrous. Ayakakashi combine Ayakashi, supernatural entities, with Kakashi, scarecrow, to create school uniform children with blade limbs and straw-stuffed bodies. These creatures appear in agricultural settings and schools, two locations central to traditional Japanese childhood experiences. Their design suggests innocence corrupted, education twisted into violence, and the pastoral life revealed as fundamentally threatening. Ara-Abare take their name from Wild Rampage and appear as massive flower-covered entities wreathed in red spider lilies, Higanbana in Japanese. These flowers traditionally bloom in autumn and are associated with death, the afterlife, and separation from loved ones. The monsters transform this natural beauty into something overwhelming and destructive, reflecting themes about how even Japan's most celebrated aesthetics can become oppressive when taken to extremes. Harai Kadashiro draw their name from Shinto purification rituals, where paper dolls absorb spiritual impurities. In the game, these creatures feature traditional okame mask faces, theatrical masks representing joy and good fortune, twisted into expressions of manic desperation. They represent the failure of traditional spiritual practices to address modern psychological trauma. Oyomoi appear as masses of doll heads and arms, their name relating both to calling attention, oi, and emotional weight, omoi. These creatures embody the pressure of social expectations, the weight of others' gazes, and the fear of being overwhelmed by competing demands for attention and performance. The cultural puzzle mechanics integrate as deeply as the monster design. Players encounter EMA prayer tablets where they must write wishes, scarecrow identification challenges that require understanding facial expressions and body language, and shrine-based mechanics that assume familiarity with Shinto practices. These aren't generic puzzles with Japanese aesthetics, but gameplay elements that emerge directly from cultural understanding. Ryukishi Zero 07 designed these cultural elements to connect directly with the story themes, rather than serving as exotic decoration. Understanding the cultural context enhances the experience, but the emotional core, family trauma, social pressure, the struggle for individual identity translates across cultural boundaries. Audio design and Akira Yamaoka's return. Akira Yamaoka's return as composer represents one of Silent Hill F's strongest connections to the series' legacy, though his approach for this entry emphasizes authentically Japanese musical elements guided by wabi-sabi philosophy, finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence. The soundtrack incorporates children's choirs, traditional Japanese instrumentation, and the industrial ambient textures that defined the original games but filtered through specifically Japanese aesthetic sensibilities. Yamaoka's audio philosophy revolutionized horror game sound design across the series' history. His core principle, lack of sound, impresses people more than beautiful music. Yamaoka intentionally placed audio ahead of visual cues to induce anxiety, using silence as a weapon of psychological terror. His broken radio mechanic, static emission near enemies, became the series' trademark, while his 3D audio positioning used directional sound for psychological effect. The technological progression across Team Silent games shows Yamaoka's evolving approach. Silent Hill 1 featured pure industrial elements using basic PC setup, drawing from 9-inch nails and DAF. Silent Hill 2 introduced rock and grunge elements alongside the industrial bass using Mac's MSP composition software. Silent Hill 3 featured complex arrangements with church and religious musical elements, marking the first prominent vocal integration. Silent Hill 4 represented experimental sounds with apartment-specific audio design that reflected the game's claustrophobic themes. For Silent Hill F, Yamaoka collaborates with Kensuke Inage plus Dai and Zaki from Ryukishi 07's previous projects. This represents fusion of Yamaoka's industrial horror mastery with Ryukishi 07's visual novel audio experience from When They Cry series. Ryukishi 07 specifically chose Yamaoka because, to this day, I remember the feeling of my first encounter with the strangulating and oppressive atmosphere of Silent Hill. It still deeply haunts me, and it still utterly fascinates me. Preview coverage consistently praises the audio implementation. The game supports 3D spatial audio that makes environmental sounds feel uncomfortably intimate, footsteps echoing in ways that suggest pursuit, whispers that seem to come from just outside peripheral hearing, and ambient sounds that gradually shift from natural to unnatural without clear transition points. The voice acting features full Japanese and English recordings, with Japanese performances emphasizing regional dialects and speaking patterns that would have been specific to 1960s mountain communities. These linguistic details won't register for international players, but they demonstrate the development team's commitment to cultural authenticity rather than generic Japanese flavor. Environmental audio design appears particularly sophisticated based on preview impressions. The fog that transforms Ebisugaoka doesn't just change what players see, it alters how sound travels, creating acoustic spaces that feel wrong in ways that enhance psychological discomfort. Familiar sounds become threatening when heard through supernatural fog, and silence becomes more oppressive when it suggests something listening. The integration of traditional Japanese musical elements with Yamaoka's signature industrial soundscapes creates audio landscapes that feel both familiar and alien to series veterans. Children's lullabies become threatening when processed through electronic distortion. Traditional festival music becomes ominous when played at wrong speeds or in wrong contexts. These techniques honor the series' audio legacy while establishing distinct cultural identity. Technical implementation and visual design. Silent Hill F runs on Unreal Engine 5, representing a significant technological leap from the series' PlayStation era origins. The visual presentation emphasizes the contrast between natural beauty and supernatural corruption that runs through Japanese aesthetic philosophy. Cherry blossoms bloom on twisted trees, traditional architecture shows signs of decay, and the famous Silent Hill fog transforms familiar environments into alien landscapes. This modern technical approach contrasts sharply with Team Silent's original constraints as strengths philosophy. The PlayStation's limitations became Silent Hill's defining characteristics, with fog originally used to hide draw distance limitations before becoming integral to the game's identity. Silent Hill F, developed with modern hardware capabilities, approaches atmosphere differently through high-fidelity visuals, photogrammetry of real Japanese locations, and 4K textures to create beauty that becomes unsettling through context rather than technical limitation. The character and monster design comes from Kira, a renowned Japanese illustrator known for combining beautiful and grotesque elements. Screenshots and preview footage show incredible attention to detail in facial expressions, clothing textures, and environmental storytelling. Hinako's school uniform shows appropriate wear patterns. The town's buildings display authentic period architecture, and the fog effects create genuinely atmospheric visual environments. Preview coverage notes particularly impressive implementation of atmospheric effects. The fog doesn't simply reduce visibility, it actively transforms the environment, revealing different architectural details and creating new spatial relationships between familiar locations. Traditional Japanese buildings become more threatening when partially obscured, and the interplay between lighting and fog creates visual uncertainty that enhances psychological tension. The game's visual design emphasizes practical effects over supernatural spectacle, rather than relying on obvious CGI monsters or explosive supernatural events. Silent Hill F creates horror through environmental storytelling, subtle visual changes, and the gradual revelation that familiar spaces have become fundamentally wrong. This technical philosophy reflects the broader design approach of finding horror through cultural authenticity rather than generic shock effects. The photogrammetry of actual Japanese locations creates environments that feel lived in and historically accurate, making the supernatural transformation more unsettling because it corrupts recognizable reality. Series evolution and cultural translation. Understanding Silent Hill F's significance requires examining how the franchise evolved through different cultural perspectives and development philosophies. The series represents a fascinating case study in how cultural viewpoint, technical constraints, and design philosophy fundamentally shape interactive horror experiences. Team Silent's original approach from 1999 to 2004 prioritized what researchers call modern American horror through Japanese eyes. The team created survival horror that explored American themes, suburban decay, industrial decline, gun violence, but filtered through Japanese cultural perspectives that emphasize psychological tension over explicit violence. This cultural translation created unique horror experiences that neither purely American nor purely Japanese development teams might have achieved. The Western interpretation period from 2007 to 2012 reveals how cultural misunderstanding can fundamentally alter a franchise's identity. Games like Silent Hill, Origins, Homecoming, Shattered Memories, and Downpour attempted to recreate Team Silent's approach but missed crucial cultural elements. Western developers emphasized action-oriented combat, explicit violence, and conventional horror movie aesthetics, directly contradicting the series' vulnerability themes. Critical reception patterns clearly show this decline. Metacritic scores demonstrate the correlation between development philosophy and quality. Silent Hill 2 scored 89 out of 100 as a visual and oral masterpiece, while Western entries showed declining scores, culminating in Downpour's 67 out of 100 rating described as could have been good, bogged down by problems. Silent Hill F represents an attempt to resolve this cultural translation problem by returning to authentic Japanese development while incorporating modern gameplay elements. Producer Al Yang explicitly stated the goal to avoid overly westernized approaches while creating something distinct from simply recreating Silent Hill 2 over and over again. The game's approach to protagonist agency reflects this cultural evolution, where Team Silent created protagonists discovering predetermined trauma, and Western developers often created action heroes with military backgrounds. Silent Hill F features Hinako as a character who actively makes her own choices rather than being pulled along by the story. This represents evolution in both horror, narrative design, and cultural perspective on female agency. Preview coverage and critical reception. Major gaming outlets participated in extensive hands-on previews at Konami's Tokyo headquarters in August 2025, with journalists playing approximately 5 hours of the game. The critical reception has been overwhelmingly positive, though with important caveats about gameplay balance and mechanical implementation. IGN described Silent Hill F as a horror game that gets everything right, praising the atmospheric design, cultural authenticity, and psychological depth. GameSpot's Jessica Cogswell stated it has the potential to be the best game in the series, highlighting the integration of Japanese folklore with classic Silent Hill themes. Game Informer noted the visual design and audio implementation while expressing concerns about combat pacing. The most significant criticism emerging from preview coverage concerns stamina, regeneration, and combat balance. Multiple outlets reported that slow stamina recovery significantly affects combat pacing, with Game Informer describing a boss fight that took a full hour due to stamina limitations. This suggests that while the combat system adds strategic depth, it may frustrate players who prefer more active engagement with enemies. Technical performance during preview sessions was generally smooth, with outlets praising the visual fidelity and atmospheric effects, while noting occasional frame rate drops during intensive fog effects. The game appears well optimized for its target platforms, though final performance will depend on day one patches and driver optimizations. Several previews emphasize the game's commitment to cultural authenticity over accessibility. The Japanese cultural elements aren't explained in detail for international audiences. Players are expected to either understand the references or experience them as mysterious elements that enhance the otherworldly atmosphere. This approach may alienate some players while deepening the experience for others. Tech Radar named Silent Hill a F Best of Gamescom 2025, while PlayStation Blog's hands-on report praised the game's approach to finding beauty in terror. The consistent praise for atmospheric design and cultural authenticity suggests that the development team has successfully captured the psychological depth that made the original games effective. The 5 confirmed endings include variations that respond to player choices throughout the story, not just final decision points. Preview coverage suggests these endings provide meaningfully different narrative resolutions rather than superficial variations, with the traditional UFO ending serving as a reward for New Game Plus completion. Community reception and controversies. The Silent Hill fan base remains deeply divided about Silent Hill F's approach to the series formula, reflecting broader debates about horror game evolution and cultural authenticity. Traditional fans express concern that the combat system fundamentally alters the survival horror experience, while others appreciate the developers' willingness to evolve the formula rather than simply recreating past successes. The combat controversy centers on whether Silent Hill F represents evolution or betrayal of the series' core identity. Critics argue that the emphasis on timing, resource management, and active combat engagement transforms Silent Hill into something more action-oriented than psychological horror. They point to Team Silent's original philosophy of deliberate vulnerability and argue that any improvement to combat mechanics undermines the fundamental helplessness that made the series effective. Supporters counter that the combat system creates tension and vulnerability while requiring strategic thinking rather than button mashing. They argue that the sanity mechanic and resource management create psychological consequences for combat engagement, maintaining the series' themes while allowing more active gameplay. The fact that focus abilities permanently reduce maximum sanity capacity creates meaningful long-term consequences for relying on combat effectiveness. Producer Motoi Okamoto has repeatedly defended the combat mechanics, noting that stamina meters and dodge mechanics appeared in Silent Hill 3 and 4. He argues that Silent Hill F represents action horror rather than Souls-like gaming, despite surface similarities in timing-based combat and resource management. The development team clearly anticipated these comparisons and prepared responses that emphasize the game's psychological horror priorities. Fan theories about the title's meaning include feminist, flowers, fallout, and female, though developers have remained deliberately ambiguous about the specific significance. The most popular interpretation connects the F to the game's focus on female experience and feminist themes, given Hinako's story and the 1960s setting's emphasis on restrictive gender roles. Community speculation about connections to broader Silent Hill lore remains largely unfounded. While the game shares thematic elements with previous entries, fog, psychological trauma, symbolic monsters, it appears to function as a standalone story rather than a direct continuation of established narratives. This approach allows newcomers to experience the game without extensive series knowledge while avoiding contradictions with existing lore. The community discussion reveals sophisticated understanding of the series' development history and cultural context. Fans appreciate the backstory of how technical limitations became atmospheric strengths, creating informed criticism of later entries. The 2024 Silent Hill 2 Remake's positive reception demonstrates that faithful interpretation of original design principles succeeds better than wholesale reimagining attempts. Some fan theories connect the 1960s setting to generational trauma from atomic bombings, though this remains speculative and unsupported by official materials. The game's focus on family dysfunction and social pressure provides sufficient thematic material without requiring connections to broader historical trauma. Cultural impact and series direction. Silent Hill F represents the most culturally specific entry in the series since the original 1999 game. While previous Western developed entries attempted to recreate the aesthetic and thematic elements that made Team Silent's work effective, Silent Hill F draws directly from Japanese cultural sources to create genuinely local horror that happens to use the Silent Hill framework. This approach carries both risks and benefits that extend beyond the immediate game. Players familiar with Japanese culture, folklore, and social history will experience layers of meaning that international audiences might miss. Cultural references that feel natural to Japanese players may seem arbitrary or exotic to others. The development team chose authenticity over accessibility, creating an experience that may not translate equally across cultural boundaries. The contrast between Silent Hill F's cultural specificity and previous games' universal themes reveals how horror translates across cultures. Team Silent's original games explored American suburban decay and industrial decline through Japanese psychological perspectives, creating unique hybrid horror that neither purely American nor purely Japanese teams might have achieved. Western developers attempted to recreate this without understanding the cultural translation that made it effective. Silent Hill F reverses this dynamic by presenting authentic Japanese horror through the Silent Hill framework. Rather than Japanese developers interpreting American themes, we have Japanese developers exploring Japanese themes through a franchise that gained international recognition. This represents a fascinating test of whether cultural authenticity can transcend language barriers through emotional truth and sophisticated design. The game's emphasis on female experience and 1960s social constraints provides thematic coherence that extends beyond simple nostalgia for the series' Japanese origins. Rikishi 07's involvement ensures that these cultural elements serve narrative purposes rather than functioning as surface-level decoration. The horror emerges from specifically Japanese anxieties about family, social conformity, and individual agency rather than generic supernatural threats. Silent Hill F's commercial and critical success will likely influence Konami's future approach to the franchise. Positive reception might encourage more culturally specific entries that explore horror through particular historical and social contexts. Poor reception might suggest that the international Silent Hill audience prefers more universally accessible themes and mechanics. The game's technical ambition, Unreal Engine 5, extensive voice acting in multiple languages, complex mechanical systems, represents significant investment in the franchise's future. Konami clearly views Silent Hill F as more than a nostalgic callback, but as a foundation for renewed development efforts. Whether Silent Hill F succeeds in balancing cultural specificity with international appeal will determine much about the series' future direction. The game's approach represents a gamble that authentic cultural horror can transcend language and cultural barriers through emotional truth and sophisticated mechanical design. Release preparations and final thoughts. As September 25th approaches, Silent Hill F enters the final phase of pre-release marketing and community anticipation. The extensive preview coverage has revealed most major gameplay and story elements while preserving key narrative surprises. Players know what kind of experience to expect: culturally specific Japanese horror with active combat mechanics and resource management systems. But the emotional impact and narrative effectiveness remain to be discovered. The game's mature rating and explicit content warnings suggest that NeoBards isn't compromising on the disturbing themes that made the original games effective. Family abuse, social pressure, and psychological trauma receive direct treatment rather than metaphorical suggestion. This approach may alienate players seeking more subtle horror, but it demonstrates commitment to meaningfully exploring difficult subject matter. Technical specifications and platform availability ensure that most interested players can access the game regardless of their preferred gaming setup. The range of difficulty options, separate settings for combat and puzzle challenge, acknowledges that Silent Hill attracts players with different preferences and skill levels. Story mode provides access to narrative content without demanding mastery of combat mechanics. The development team's emphasis on cultural authenticity over universal accessibility represents a bold choice that may define the game's legacy. Silent Hill F succeeds or fails based on whether authentic cultural horror can create meaningful experiences for international audiences, not whether it recreates the surface elements that made previous games popular. Pre-order availability and digital deluxe early access suggest that Konami expects significant launch interest despite fan-base controversies. The 48-hour early access period will provide initial community reactions that may influence broader reception when the game becomes widely available. The broader implications for horror game design extend beyond the Silent Hill franchise. Silent Hill F represents a crucial test case for whether classic horror game design can evolve without losing essential identity. By combining authentic cultural perspective, modern technical capabilities, and respect for original design philosophy, while introducing contemporary mechanics, it attempts to solve fundamental questions about horror game evolution. Early reception suggests cautious optimism from both critics and fans who understand the series' complex development history. The consistent praise for atmospheric design and cultural authenticity, combined with concerns about mechanical balance, indicates that Silent Hill F has successfully captured the psychological depth that made the original games effective while creating new challenges through its innovation. Conclusion: beauty in imperfection. Silent Hill F emerges as the most ambitious and controversial entry in the series since Silent Hill 4: The Room. It represents a fundamental choice about what Silent Hill means. Is it a specific set of mechanical and aesthetic conventions, or a framework for exploring psychological horror through particular cultural lenses? The game's commitment to Japanese cultural authenticity, female-centered narrative, and evolved combat mechanics positions it as either a successful modernization or a fundamental departure from series identity. Early critical reception suggests technical competence and atmospheric effectiveness, but community reception will ultimately determine whether these changes enhance or diminish the Silent Hill experience. This represents more than simply returning to Japanese development. It's an attempt to reclaim the cultural translation that made Team Silent's original games effective while addressing the mistakes of the Western interpretation period. The series' evolution from Japanese developers exploring American themes to Western developers misunderstanding Japanese methodology to Japanese developers authentically exploring Japanese themes creates a complete circle of cultural perspective. Ryukishi 07's script, Akira Yamaoka's return, Kira's monster design, and NeoBard's technical implementation create a package that honors the series' psychological horror legacy while establishing distinctly new creative directions. Whether this approach succeeds depends on execution details that preview coverage cannot fully evaluate. The effectiveness of narrative payoffs, the balance between challenge and frustration, and the emotional impact of cultural themes that may not translate perfectly across audiences. The broader test Silent Hill F presents extends beyond horror gaming to questions of cultural authenticity in international media. Can a work rooted in specific cultural context create universal emotional experiences? The original Team Silent games succeeded by filtering American themes through Japanese sensibilities, creating hybrid horror that felt both familiar and alien to international audiences. Silent Hill F reverses this dynamic, presenting authentic Japanese horror through an internationally recognized framework. The technical evolution from PlayStation-era constraints to modern Unreal Engine 5 capabilities reflects broader changes in game development, where Team Silent transformed hardware limitations into atmospheric strengths, fog hiding draw distance, loading delays creating tension. Silent Hill F must create similar effects through deliberate design choices rather than technical necessity. This requires sophisticated understanding of what made the originals effective beyond their surface characteristics. The combat controversy ultimately reflects different philosophies about player agency in horror experiences. Team Silent's deliberate vulnerability placed players in the position of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Western developers often misunderstood this as poor design rather than intentional choice. Silent Hill F attempts middle ground by creating combat that requires thought and consequence while maintaining psychological stakes through the sanity system. Silent Hill F represents a gamble that authentic cultural horror transcends surface aesthetics to create universal emotional experiences. The fog that transforms Ebisugaoka carries both natural beauty and supernatural menace, embodying the wabi-sabi philosophy that finds meaning in imperfection and impermanence. Whether players embrace this philosophy or reject it in favor of more familiar approaches will determine the game's place in the series' continuing evolution. The development team's choice to prioritize cultural authenticity over accessibility signals confidence in their vision while acknowledging the risk of alienating international audiences. Preview coverage suggests they've succeeded in creating atmospheric horror that honors the series' legacy while establishing new directions. The consistent praise for environmental design, audio implementation, and cultural integration indicates careful attention to elements that made the original games effective. Yet questions remain about mechanical balance, pacing issues, and whether the combat system enhances or detracts from psychological horror. The stamina limitations that created hour-long boss fights in preview sessions suggest potential frustration that could undermine atmospheric immersion. These execution details will determine whether Silent Hill F achieves its ambitious goals or becomes another well-intentioned experiment that misunderstands what makes horror gaming effective. The success or failure of Silent Hill F will likely influence how horror games approach cultural specificity, protagonist agency, and mechanical evolution. Positive reception could encourage more developers to create culturally authentic horror experiences rather than generic international products. Poor reception might suggest that horror gaming audiences prefer familiar mechanics over innovative approaches, regardless of atmospheric effectiveness. We are now left with anticipation and uncertainty. Silent Hill F promises to be many things, culturally authentic, mechanically sophisticated, thematically ambitious, but whether it succeeds in being genuinely frightening remains the ultimate test. The game stands at the intersection of multiple traditions. Team Silent's psychological innovation, Japanese horror's cultural specificity, modern technical capabilities, and contemporary design philosophy. In just a few days, the fog will lift, and we'll discover whether this latest entry in the series captures the essence that made Silent Hill special, or creates something entirely new that happens to share the name. The answers will shape not only the future of this beloved franchise, but potentially influence how horror games approach cultural authenticity, mechanical innovation, and the delicate balance between honoring legacy and embracing evolution. Sweet dreams, and may your nightmares be beautiful in their own imperfect way.